Hello learners, and welcome to the 21st lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. We will continue our discussion of the work of the American poet Edna St. Vincent Millay. In the previous lectures, I have introduced the poet, given a brief overview of the life and times of this person, and provided a detailed look, a close reading of every word of the first and, it has to be said, long poem, Renaissance. I concluded that commentary by drawing parallels between the work of Edna St. Vincent Millay and another prolific and popular Victorian poet named Christina Rossetti. I will briefly talk a little bit about that parallel and move on to other poems by Millay. I compared the work of these two poets because they were both extremely popular, that is, they were very well loved and admired by people. They had a reputation of being less intellectually brilliant and more accessible. They also had a somewhat open relationship to a somewhat conservative aspect of life, that is, religion and spirituality. Christina Rossetti was very avowedly religious, very devoutly religious, and wore her religion and her divinity on her sleeve. And her poems contain a very vivid and honest engagement with religion. The same cannot be said about Edna St. Vincent Millay. But what brings the two poets closer is that both explore very sincerely and very honestly the changing emotional landscape of the poet's mind. And both are unafraid to describe where those changing thoughts take the poet. In the case of Edna St. Vincent Millay, while the person and the poet herself are known to be not religious, in fact, are quite irreverent when it comes to religion, that does not stop the poems from going as far and as wide across the spiritual realm. And if the poem requires, if the logical progression of thought requires that the poet goes into a religious realm, then that's exactly what the poem does. The unafraid spiritual exploration, the courage to explore spiritual realms and going into religious spheres is something that brings both these poets together. Now, we will read other kinds of poems by Edna St. Vincent Millay now. I will stick to the first volumes for the initial period and then move on to the later volumes. The poem I will focus on now is Blight. Blight comes from Millay's first volume, that is Renaissance and Other Poems, and it's a very powerful exploration of strange emotions and emotions that might appear to be quite outlandish, which is why they are described using a metaphor, the metaphor of gardening and cultivation. And as that metaphor is developed, we find that the thoughts themselves are described in greater detail. And some of the outlandish nature of these thoughts is domesticated. So just as agriculture is a way of domesticating the wildness of nature, this poem uses the metaphor of gardening in order to make a somewhat strange and outlandish thought appear and feel more sedate, more domestic. Let us see how all these thoughts are played out in this poem. The poem is titled Blight, and I will read and comment on stanzas one by one. Blight by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Hard seeds of hate I planted, that should by now be grown. Rough stalks and from thick stamens, a poisonous pollen blown, and odors rank, unbreathable, from dark corollas thrown. The word blight. The word blight refers to a disease. It is used as a disease for any kind of living being, but specifically the word origins from a disease that occurs to plants. And the cause of blight is usually infection from sort of fungus or some sort of a pathological microorganism, a pathogen. So it is strange to title a poem with a word that signifies a diseased plant or a plant which is afflicted by an infection from a fungus and is sick. Who is sick? The title suggests that the plants are sick. With that, the words of the poem flow. And the first line, the poet declares something about plants. The poet says, "Hard seeds of hate I planted, that should by now be grown." Right? So we get gardening, we get a plant, but it is an unusual plant. It is a plant that is not recognizable as a physical plant. In fact, the plant for which the poet says that she has planted seeds is of a plant called hate. Hate is an emotion. Hate is not an actual plant. So when the poet says that she has planted seeds of hate, what she's actually saying is that she has done something to a particular emotion, a feeling that she once had, a feeling of hatred for someone or something. The object, the target of that hatred is not clear, but the emotion as it exists in the poet's mind, that is clear. The poet did something to that emotion, placed it somewhere in herself, which is the equivalent of planting seeds in the soil. Right? So the poet tried to deal with a feeling of hatred and describes that by saying that I planted seeds of hate that should now be grown, meaning it has been some time, so following the normal course of the growth of plants means that at the time that the poet is writing, the plant of hatred should have grown. That is, there should be stalks and stamens and pollen and odors and corollas, that is, flowers. Right? But these features, these aspects of normal plants have a particularly negative characterization. The stalks are rough, stamens are thick, pollen is poisonous, odors are rank, unbreathable, etc. So this should have been the case, but is it the case? We are not told exactly why it is not. Maybe it is. Maybe this is what has happened, that instead of proper or normal plants, the poet seems to have had a diseased or abnormal plant. Okay, this is how the first stanza ends. And the poet continues, "At dawn from my damp garden, I shook the chilly dew. The thin boughs locked behind me that sprang to let me through. The blossoms slept. I sought a place where nothing lovely grew." So this plant has grown. It is not a good plant. It is not a normal plant, but it is something that the poet still considers her own. Right? She seeks a place where nothing lovely grows. Right? She realizes that this plant that has grown from her seeds of hate is not a good place, but it is still her place, because she is seeking something of that negative emotion. And then she further writes, "And there, when day was breaking, I knelt and looked down. The light was near, the silence was palpitant with sound. I drew my hate from out my breast and thrust it in the ground. O ye so fiercely tended, ye little seeds of hate, I bent above your growing, early and noon and late. Yet are ye drooped and pitiful, I cannot rear ye straight." So the poet describes how and why this plant, which has now grown, and between whose boughs she now seeks a place of comfort, even though it is not lovely. The poet goes back into the past, describes the process of its origin. And the poet describes that she drew the hate from out of her breast and thrust it into the ground. So her impulse of planting these seeds of hate was not to nurture the hate, but in fact to remove it from some place, remove it from herself. So when she removes the hate from herself, she wants to be rid of it. She wants to move on from something. She wants to remove these negative, destructive, and somewhat less productive aspects from her emotional and intellectual life, wants to give it a separate existence outside of her body so that the hate can grow but not affect her or not impede her in her own growth. This was her impulse. And yet she tends to these seeds of hate quite fiercely, she argues. She bends above their growing, tends to their growth. Yet she is surprised that the plant or the shoots that come up from these seeds are drooped and pitiful. She is disappointed that she cannot rear these seeds in a straight way. Now, the question is, what would be straight? What is she looking for? The very fact that she has ejected hate from herself and given it a place in the soil, in the ground, means that it is not her own. And yet she desires for some normalcy in that growth of these seeds as well. Even though these seeds are no longer a part of her body, she still wants them to have a normal life, a straight plant. She wants the shoots to grow up in a straight manner, and she's not getting that. And this is a source of great disappointment. The last stanza goes, "The sun seeks out my garden, no nook is left in shade. No mist, nor mold, nor mildew endures on any blade. Sweet rain slants under every bough, ye falter and ye fade." The poet describes how the conditions for normal growth are all met. There is no deficiency in terms of the weather. There is no deficiency in terms of nutrition. There is no deficiency in the environment. There is no mist or mold or mildew, meaning there's no moisture which can lead to the growth of fungus or other kinds of pathogens. There is adequate and proper amount of rain, sunshine, air, ventilation, everything, right? Despite all of these conditions being met, the shoots that emerge from these seeds of hate do not survive, do not grow. They falter and fade. The poem ends there, and the sort of conclusion that the poet gives, the resolution to this intellectual inquiry, seems to suggest that the seeds of hate are doomed to this kind of a faulty, diseased, and death-like existence. The metaphor of gardening, right, helps the poet express something about the negative emotion of hate. The fact that the poet wants to nurture this hate means that the poet considers all of these emotions as equally valuable. Just because the feeling involves hatred doesn't automatically disqualify it from being nourished. For a poet, hatred is as valuable as love or joy. But the poet still wants to give this valuable emotion a different home, which is why the poet says that she drew this hate from out of her breast and thrust it into the ground. There is a violence in that act. There's a violence that involves the planting of these seeds of hate. And perhaps this violence is reflected in the fact that the plant that emerges from these seeds of hate grows, but demonstrates at best a diseased growth, which is described in the word blight. Now, to extend this metaphor somewhat, we can reflect on the title, Blight, in the light of how the poem has concluded. Blight refers quite literally to the diseased quality of the leaves and the shoots that emerge from these seeds of hate. Blight also refers, metaphorically speaking, to the emotional growth of the poet. The poet is trying to achieve something. The poet is trying to grow in their emotional capacities while having segregated and removed hatred from her emotional life. The growth of the poet, having subtracted hatred from her emotional existence, can be likened to a blighted existence. What would be the alternative? To not remove hatred? What would then happen? If the poet had not violently removed hatred and placed it in a separate home, the soil is an alien home for hatred. What would be a more normal home for hatred? The poet's own self. Would that have led to the unblighted or healthy development of the poet's emotional capacity? This is a question that the poem leaves us with and asks us to ponder long after the poet has stopped speaking. So we have seen a very rich exploration of a very powerful and complex emotion. There is a contradictory impulse here to be rid of hate, to be rid of negative emotional forces, to yearn for an existence removed from hate. And yet the process by which one seeks such a removal from hate, such a detachment from hate, seems itself to lead to a blighted existence. Whether that blight applies to the growth of hate outside oneself, or whether that blighted existence refers to the self which is removed of hatred, that is an open question. But the poet displays a remarkable openness and courage in this intellectual inquiry. Now, intellectual inquiry is an important concept to hold on to while we explore the work of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Intellectual inquiry can be placed in a binary opposition to the phrase excessive femininity. This is a phrase that I have created to describe how many readers, scholarly as well as general readers, have reacted to and described Millay's poems. In academic contexts especially, there have been some very unfortunate and unfair characterizations of Millay's poems as being too feminine. For instance, the scholar John Crow Ransom, famously known for new criticism, and one of the famous Southern scholars, the scholars from the southern states of the US, who were writing in the middle of the 20th century. John Crow Ransom famously and infamously, I must say, declared that Millay's poems were deficient in what he called masculinity. Ransom further deemed Millay's poems unworthy of attention from the, and I quote, Ransom, intellectual adult male, unquote. So this was only one of the most unfortunate descriptions or examples of what was quite a widespread and general perception. Many scholars and readers felt that Millay's writing was too feminine. It can be demonstrated, and I have been doing that, I hope, in this past few lectures, and I will continue to do that in the remainder of my discussion of Millay's works, that this is an unfair characterization, that there is enough intellectual content, there is enough seriousness, and these qualities are not the prerogative of male poets. In fact, if intellectual and serious are adjectives that can be used for the work of male poets, then Millay's poetry also qualifies for that award of being masculine. So there is not a deficiency of masculinity. if masculinity stands for serious intellectual content. In fact, there is ample amount of intellectual and serious content in Millay's works. One way in which we can prepare ourselves to receive, appreciate, and understand the serious intellectual content of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poetry is by understanding and appreciating the expertise that she developed and the success that she came to have in practicing one particular type of poems, which is the sonnet. Before I go further, I'll take a brief moment to establish what the sonnet is, how Edna St. Vincent Millay received it, what was the literary history of this particular poetic form, and how we can appreciate the complexity of this form in Millay's work. So what is a sonnet? And while defining this form, I'll be guided by the work of Rachel Richardson, the poet and scholar, who has published an article on the sonnet in the Poetry Foundation website. The English word sonnet comes from the Italian word sonetto, which literally means little song. The word sonnet and the poetic form it describes captures some of the most complex writing in the English language. The sonnet as a poetic form is the strictest, the oldest, and the most enduring poetic form in the English language. It is strict because it follows a very particular arrangement of sound. Every line must sound in a particular way, every line must end with a particular sound, and every line must align with every other line in a very particular arrangement of sound. That is what gives the sonnet its musical quality, which is why it qualifies for the title of little song. Meeting all of these formal criteria is quite challenging, so it is quite remarkable that a poet like Edna St. Vincent Millay was able to write so many sonnets. In fact, the quality that most surprises and most impresses today is the sheer number of sonnets that Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote, and the sheer number of those sonnets which are of a remarkable and high quality. Now, it goes without saying that if a poet has written tens, if not hundreds of sonnets, then many of those sonnets will not be memorable or remarkable. Some of them will be quite ordinary. And it is true that quite a few sonnets are quite ordinary. In fact, the writer Laurie Moore describes most of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poems as soggy. Soggy as paper that is no longer crisp, or food that is no longer crisp because it has been spoiled by moisture. Because Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote so many sonnets, it is natural that quite a few of them may be soggy. But an equally high number of them are of a very high quality, and that is something that we must always pause and be impressed by. To return to the history of the sonnet originates in the 13th century in the Italian court, and the inventor of this poetic form is the poet Giacomo da Lentini. But the poet who gave this form a life, who wrote some of the most iconic and well-loved instances of this poetic form, was Francesco Petrarca, known in English as Petrarch. Furthermore, for English speakers, the poet who has done the most to make the sonnet an iconic form is William Shakespeare, and it is William Shakespeare who gives the sonnet the shape that it is most recognizable as today. That is 14 lines, each line organized according to the iambic pentameter and having 5 meters, that is 10 syllables, each syllable arranged in the order of an iamb, that is one unstressed and one stressed syllable. Uh, there's one more quality of the sonnet which one must notice before moving on. It is that this was the first poetic form that was meant to be read silently, as opposed to being heard recited aloud by a live performer. So it is a musical form, which means that the musical quality of the sonnet travels from mediums to medium. That is, the form itself is musical. The way the words are arranged is itself musical, so it does not have to be actually recited or sung like literal music in order for the musicality of it to survive. That is to say, the form ensures its musicality even if it is not performed. And indeed, the sonnet, as Shakespeare wrote it, was a form that was published and that was read silently in book form by many readers. It was not primarily performed. It was performed on stage in many of Shakespeare's plays, but there was an equally high number of the sonnet which was read silently. And its power, its musicality, its ability to explain and articulate powerful emotions, to provide pleasure, was preserved even when it was read silently by people holding a book in their hands. The scholar Paul Oppenheimer has described the sonnet as the first lyric of self-consciousness. For Oppenheimer, the sonnet is a form that allows us to witness the individual self in conflict. We will continue this discussion of the historical and technical overview of the sonnet as a poetic form before going on to reading some powerful instances of the sonnet and of seeing how this very powerful form is given a new life in the work of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Thank you.